David J. Brown has interviewed the world's most creative and controversial thinkers. These interviews are chronicled in 4 books: Voices from the Edge, Conversations on the Edge of the Apocalypse, Mavericks of Medicine, and his first book of interviews, Mavericks of the Mind, which has just been reissued in expanded form. In this program, David talks about 2 of the 4 interviewees who have influenced him most: ethnobotanist and shamanic explorer Terence McKenna, and Rupert Sheldrake. David, your book, Mavericks of the Mind, has just been re-released in expanded form. Could you tell us what's new about it?
There's a brand new artwork on the cover, for one thing, and we got about 100 pages of new material in it. There's a new interview with Timothy Leary, there's new photographs, new artwork throughout the book, and most importantly, we included the roundtable discussions that we put on as events after the book was published. After the book was published, we brought together the people from the book, people like Timothy Leary, Oscar Janiger, Laura Huxley, Robert Anton Wilson, Stephen LaBerge, and got them up on stage up at UCLA and at UC Santa Cruz, and had them debate controversial topics, get them to argue as much as they possibly could. And so we included those discussions that everybody had about the different topics in the book in this copy of the book at the end of the book. So all that material is now included in this copy of the book.
When you first wrote the book, Mavericks of the Mind, you cited the need for a new paradigm, that the paradigm that we've been used to has been changing. How has the paradigm changed since 1993, since you published the book?
Well, it depends on what paradigm you're talking about. Paradigms in science have gotten a little bit more open-minded since the publication of the book. There's definitely a little bit more interest and open-mindedness in psychology towards consciousness and understanding how and why we become conscious. That's something that was looked upon as fringe science when I originally wrote the book. The other thing that's really changed since the publication of Mavericks of the Mind is the development of the internet. And that, I think, has really shifted consciousness quite a bit. It was the acceleration of technology that was partly the inspiration for doing the book. And the most profound change that's really happened since then is this, incredible network that human beings have created that allows anybody to communicate with anybody else instantaneously and give any human being more access to information than even the greatest world leaders had 20 years ago at their fingertips.
Right. So, what motivated you to interview these great thinkers? I think you were just 26 at the time?
Yeah, I was pretty young when I started. I was in an unusual position. I really owe a lot to a fellow named Francis Jeffrey, who had suggested when I just graduated from NYU, that he said, every time you read a book and you really enjoy the book, you should contact the author and tell him or her that you enjoyed the book and go visit them. You'd be surprised at how many people would be excited and happy to see you. And I followed his advice. And after I graduated from NYU, I called and made appointments with a number of the different people who had really had a profound influence on me as I was growing up. And spent about 3.5 months traveling around California and visiting with people like Timothy Leary and Oscar Janiger and Robert Anton Wilson. And as a result of that, about a year later, Rebecca McClellan and I, my partner at the time, were just sitting around late at night. We used to love to get high and have philosophical discussions, and just reflecting on how many interesting people we knew, and that nobody had really interviewed them about the topics that we wanted to interview them about. What happens to consciousness after death? What do you think about God and things like that? We realized that we were in a very unique position. So that it was that realization, and having already known these people, I realized I was positioned in such a wonderful place that it just seemed like an obvious thing to do.
Your first interview was with shamanic explorer and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna. And this was your first interview, and it was challenging for you. Would you tell us why it was challenging?
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was challenging, all right. Well, it was the first interview we did, and we really weren't sure how to prepare. But I'll tell you, thank goodness, we had all of our questions pre-written, written down, and everything was prepared before we actually sat down to interview him. Because the moment that we actually sat down, we did the interview at Esalen in Big Sur, in a place called the Big House, and we all sat down on pillows in a circle. And the moment that we sat down to start the interview, Terence pulls out a big fat joint of sensibilia and hashish and lights it up and begins passing it around the group. And after Rebecca and I had taken a couple hits off this joint, it became virtually impossible for us to articulate ourselves or to do anything besides just simply read the questions off the piece of paper, one word at a time. But
so did you have a tape recorder with you?
Thank goodness we had a tape recorder, right? And thank goodness we were able to record it. But surprisingly, I mean, with all that superpowered doobie and sensibilia and hashish running through Terence's brain, he couldn't have possibly have been more articulate and more eloquent with his words. And he was absolutely dazzling. And really, really, really enjoyed interviewing him very much.
Yeah, I think one of Terence's ideas was that psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, was the catalyst that moved early humans to conscious living. How did you feel about this at the time when you heard this?
Well, I thought it was really interesting. I mean, my background is in evolutionary biology and psychobiology. So sociobiology and evolutionary biology and how behaviors and how human traits evolve is something that's been very interesting to me for a long time. And I've also been very interested in psychedelics. At the time and now, I think that it's probably a little bit far-fetched to think that it had as profound of an influence as he postulates. He goes beyond saying that it had an effect on conscious living and says that it was responsible for the human development of language. And I'm not sure if one can go that far, but I think that psychedelic plants in the natural world almost unquestionably played a role in the beginnings of the evolution of human consciousness and the elevation of human consciousness.
Right. Terence also said the acceleration of novelty is leading us to a mathematically determined point of infinite novelty. And by that he was talking about the 2012 year end of the man calendar idea. How did that idea strike you at the time?
Well, like a lot of Terence's ideas, when you hear him describe them, they sound wonderfully eloquent and brilliant. And when you try to summarize them, they always come out sounding a little bit silly. And he was a wonderful storyteller. I think that his time wave theory of novelty was fascinating. The way he arrived upon the date of 2012, though, was actually by looking at the Mayan calendar and trying to sync his novelty theory with the Mayan calendar. So it wasn't like the two dates actually worked out to be the same day on their own. He synchronized them so they worked out on that date. Terence's basic idea was that since the beginning of the universe, not only has complexity been increasing, but novelty has been increasing. Simply new things are happening more and more. There's a sort of dichotomy in the universe between habits, things that happen over and over again, and the creation of new things, novelty. And there's more of a tendency for things to be repeated the way they were than for new things to be created. And these forces are constantly playing with each other. And Terence's idea was that novelty is something that is maximizing itself or growing throughout time, and that we're reaching a point eventually where novelty reaches a sort of maximum density and becomes infinite. And he postulated this as occurring in the year 2012 at the end of December. I'm waiting to see what happens in December. I hope at least, if nothing else, we have a good party.
Yeah. So if nothing dramatic happens, at least his theory holds some water. At least it's true. Complexity is increasing, and whether we'll actually reach an endpoint is still rather problematic.
Well, whether his time wave theory actually correlates to specific historical events is a bit open to question. I think it'd be an interesting thing to look at. But in terms of whether or not I think his whether I think that there's a general truth to his ideas, I think that he was really onto something big, and I think that he was definitely onto an aspect of nature that many scientists ignore.
Yeah, you got to know him fairly well. In fact, I think you even contributed a chapter to his book, Archaic Revival.
Yes.
What do you think he meant by the term archaic revival?
Well, the word archaic means that which is very old. So he meant to bring back that which is very old. And what he was really referring to was those aspects of our lives that are very common among indigenous peoples and among people who are pre-technological. And he believed that our connection to nature is something that we've lost. Through developing technology and through immersing ourselves in the historical process, we've lost our connection to the boundary dissolving aspects of nature. And he thinks that that's a very important part of who we are, and that it's not only important for our creativity, but also for our own survival, and that all the crises on the planet right now can be brought back to that loss of what we originally had and what we need to be able to regain if we want to continue as a species.
Right. Terence said that entheogens or psychedelics are dangerous to the dominant power structure of our society, and he said that the state does not want the average person to be shaken out of his complacency and ask difficult questions. When I heard that, I wondered, well, what kind of difficult questions might one ask if one has been shaken out of one's complacency by entheogens or psychedelics?
Well, I think the most obvious questions that one asks when one's been shaken out of one's complacency like that is, how did we get here? Why are we here? And where are we going? Those are the three most basic philosophical or spiritual questions that somebody asks after they've had a religious experience, usually. And it's those three questions that usually define a religion or define a spiritual approach. I think that power structures, that governments, that institutions are frightened of psychedelics because they're boundary dissolving agents. And anything that dissolves boundaries has the capacity to dilute power structures. And people that have a lot invested in those power structures, I think, are very frightened of losing that. I think that psychedelics make people question what the government is saying. I think psychedelics make people question what they see on TV. I think psychedelics make people question themselves. So I think all that questioning is something that people who are running the corporations and running the media and running the governments don't really want from their population. So I think it's something that Terence was really right about, and this is why there's such an incredible fear and persecution and prohibition against psychedelics, because they encourage people to ask these very, very dangerous questions about who we are and where we're going.
Mm-hmm. When you look back on the time of that first interview when you were 26, can you see how Terence influenced you in the course of your life?
Sure. Yeah. One of the things that that Terence really helped me to do was he helped me to articulate my psychedelic experiences. Before Terence McKenna started describing his psychedelic experiences, the descriptions were not nearly as sophisticated. And in fact, it was kind of a common belief among people who had done psychedelics that the psychedelic experience was ineffable. It was something you couldn't put into words. That was the way it was commonly described. It was beyond words. It was something you couldn't possibly express. And Terence, with his incredible magic use of language, began to find ways to describe some of the most far-out things that one experiences on these, really heightened states of consciousness. And his ability to do this really helped influence me and helped to influence my writing of the book Brainchild, which was really about describing my psychedelic experiences. Mm-hmm. So I think his natural ability and his motivation to articulate those experiences influenced me to do it as well.
Right. So he was actually a poet of the psychedelic experience. He loosened up the language by which we can talk about what we've experienced.
Yes, I think that's a really good way to put it. Yeah.
Right, good. David, you interviewed Rupert Sheldrake, the English biochemist, the plant physiologist, and he had a theory about morphogenesis, which frankly I'm kind of in the dark about. I'd like to know, how did you become friends and colleagues with him?
Well, I first interviewed Rupert for my book Mavericks of the Mind back in 1992, I think it was. And around 5 or 6 years after I interviewed him, my friend Nina Graboy, who I also interviewed for Mavericks of the Mind, told me that Rupert was looking for somebody in California to help him work on his new book, which was about the unexplained powers of animals.
Dogs that know when their owners are coming home.
Right.
Uh-huh.
So I worked with Rupert on that book, and that's how I got to know him. I lived with him for a month in London, and I did primarily the work on the chapter that's about unusual animal behavior prior to earthquakes. Mm-hmm. And I researched that for a couple of years, actually, and pretty extensively. And there's, to this day, a website that we created out of that, www.animalsandearthquakes.com, that summarizes all the research that we did. But I also ran a lot of the experiments for Rupert's 2 books, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home and The Sense of Being Stared At. And I basically did all the California-based research for both of those books. Mm-hmm. And he was a tremendous, tremendous inspiration to me in my work.
Right. Thank God we live near the San Andreas Fault.
Well, that's why he chose me. That's because
Are you kidding?
Well, yeah, well, that's because I was already in this area. He wanted somebody who was in an earthquake-prone area to interview other people who had experienced unusual animal behavior prior to earthquakes. So I did a couple of telephone surveys and interviews with people about this, and interviewed experts, and became pretty much an expert myself on the subject. You know.
What did you discover?
That there is definitely a propensity for strange animal behavior prior to some earthquakes. According to a survey that I did, about 15% of the people in Santa Cruz County and about 15% of the people in Los Angeles County have experienced a dog or a cat or some pet or some animal acting strangely in some way, fleeing, running around, hiding, clawing, barking, doing something that's unusual prior to the earthquake, sometimes minutes, sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. But there's some kind of correlation between these events.
What might that correlation be?
Well, it seems like what's actually happening, because we researched this pretty carefully, is that in earthquake-prone areas, those areas where there's an earthquake, there's a lot of pressure in the earth. And about 15% of the Earth's crust is actually composed of quartz crystal. And when you put pressure on quartz crystal, it creates what's called a piezoelectric effect. And there's an electric charge that's built. And we know that when there's an electric field, that it actually changes the neurotransmitter ratios in animal brains. And it might be that these changes, these neurotransmitter changes in animal brains that are being caused by the electric field gradation changes are what's causing the unusual animal behavior. And this is a measurable response.
Well, that might explain why animals can kind of intuit when an earthquake is about to happen. But how would a dog know when their owner is about to come home?
Yeah, see, that's a bit more mysterious. That was some of the other research that we did, was we looked at how some animals, I mean, it's been reported for a long time by pet owners that their pets will anticipate them by waiting in a certain spot by the window or by the door or in a certain place, and until they come home. And some family members will actually say that it's a way that they know their dad is coming home or know their husband or wife is returning because, the dog's by the window. So we actually took this really seriously, and we measured this and researched this, and found people who had reported this. And what I actually did was I would go to their house and set up a video camera in the spot where the animal was reputed to wait, and the camera was left running for a period of about 4 hours. I would instruct them to leave their house and go about 15 minutes away from their house and do something that they would get involved in, but carry a beeper with them, and I would beep them at a random time, sometime over the next 4 hours. They were to immediately begin their journey home at that point. And then I would go back, collect the tape, and then review the videotape and code how long the animal was in that spot. And if the animal was in that spot more after the person began their journey home than prior, this could only be attributed to the fact that the person was on their journey home, as that's the only factor that we changed. Right. And we tried this at every time during the day so that we eliminated every factor that skeptics thought might be giving the animals a hint. The time of the day, possible scent or smell. So we did it at different times of the day. We had people come back in different types of cars, so it wasn't the sound of the car. We had people coming back when the wind was blowing in the opposite direction of the way they were coming. We had people come back in wheelchairs, so it wasn't the sound of the car. Every single skeptic criticism we addressed and still consistently found measurable effect.
That's really amazing. It might be interesting to do a book, something like When Husbands Know Their Wives Are Coming Home.
Yes, that would be great.
I mean, is there a correlation there? I mean.
Well, there's certainly a. Well, I don't know if I say certainly. There appears to be a bond, a psychic bond, a telepathic bond between people who are very closely bonded. There's some kind of communication that people who know each other really, really well, especially family members who know each other really well, will often sense when their partner or their brother or their family member is in trouble or needs help or something. It's a very commonly reported phenomena. So we think that this is actually behind what's causing dogs to anticipate their owner's arrival is the bonding between them. It's that they're so closely bonded emotionally. And yeah, it would probably be true for husbands knowing when their wives are coming home or vice versa as well.
Well, what about the book, The Sense of Being Stared At? I mean, there you're having strangers staring at someone they don't know, and yet the stranger can pick up the feeling that they're being stared at. How do you account for that? I understand.
Yes,
I understand that statistics on that are really rather remarkable. You look at
they
someone
are.
for 90 seconds, and they're going to turn around.
Yes, it is really remarkable. What's really remarkable is the studies that they've done. Rupert actually has done a number of studies, hundreds of studies that have been replicated, where what you do is you have somebody blindfolded, and there's a number of, say, 10 or 20 trials in the particular experiment, and you then have the blindfolded person guess at a predestined time, say every minute a little click will go off, and the person then has to guess whether somebody is staring at them or not. And even the average person does better than chance at that. And how do you account for that? Why would somebody do better than chance? And then there are some people who do much better than chance. There are some people who actually do really well at it. So it seems like it's actually almost even a learnable skill that you can improve it, But it's something that most people actually report. We know from doing this, this study and this research that it's a common phenomenon. Most people report that they have at some point in their life either stared at the back of somebody's head and then they turn around and look at them directly in the eyes, or else they feel kind of uncomfortable and turn around and find somebody looking right at them. So how this happens is really mysterious because conventional science can't explain it. But Rupert's theory of morphic fields may actually help to provide some evidence to explain this.
Right. Rupert said that had the idea that memories aren't stored in the brain. The idea that memories aren't stored in the brain opens the way for a new debate or a new perspective on the question of survival of death. He said that memory is not stored in the brain; it is stored in a non-material field. How do you understand that?
I'm not sure that I do fully understand that, but I think that he is onto something. It intuitively makes sense to me. The reason I say I don't fully understand it is I don't really understand how information can be stored in a field. I understand how a field can structure things like an electromagnetic field or a magnetic field can structure iron filings around a magnet in a certain pattern. But I don't understand how you can code within that field to actually memorize information. But I think Rupert was definitely onto something, and it certainly seems intuitively comfortable to me. There's something about it that I like, and the evidence does seem to support it. There does seem to be evidence that memory is stored outside of the brain, and that there is also evidence that consciousness can exist independently of the brain. Right. So because of that interesting evidence, I think that Rupert probably is onto something.
But is there any evidence that memories are stored in the brain?
Well, there's evidence that when you electrically excite certain parts of the brain, you can elicit certain memories. So that is evidence. There is evidence that if it's not stored in the brain, certainly there are certain parts of the brain that can act as different activation points for certain memories.
But that doesn't negate the idea that the brain may be a receiver rather than a generator of consciousness.
Exactly, right. That's the point, is that it may not actually contain the information. It may be more like a transceiver.
How did Rupert influence your life? I know that you said that Terence McKenna had some impact on it in his linguistic skills. How did Rupert impact your life? How did he influence your life?
Well, I think that one of the ways that Rupert really impacted my life was bringing back my love of science. When I was in graduate school studying neuroscience, I became very disillusioned studying the brain and with the arrogance that a lot of the people in the scientific community had. And one of the things that really inspired me about Rupert's work was that anybody could do science. You don't need government grants. You don't need giant academic institutions behind you. There are simple experiments that anybody can do. He wrote a wonderful book called 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, with experiments that you can do for under $20 that anybody can do that will give you evidence that conventional science has great difficulty explaining. So he really brought to the forefront for me that science is not something that has to be done by these great giant institutions with huge, grants behind them, but it's something that anybody can participate in.
Can you cite one experiment that I might go home and try?
Sure. I would try this experiment with being stared at. It's very simple. You don't need anything besides something that makes a clicking sound and a blindfold. And all you need is that and one other person. And what you do is you just simply tie a blindfold around somebody's head, and every minute you have a click go off, and that person is to write down on a piece of paper whether they feel, or they can lift up their right hand or their left hand, whether they feel they're being stared at or they feel like they're not being stared at. And then somebody just records that, and more than half the time you will actually get that the person is saying that they are being stared at more than by chance.
Or I could just go out to a cafe in Santa Cruz and try staring at somebody and see what happens.
You could try that too, but you have to actually measure it for it to actually be,
I see.
for it to be official research.
Okay. Okay.